Hi, this is Lili De Hoya Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thank you for joining me. We're starting the story of David, and this is such a tragic story. We're not going to get into the big tragedy until next week, but we see that his life has some really difficult beginnings as well. And I don't know about you, but for some reason I always seem to remember the story of Joseph of Egypt when I'm reading about David, and vice versa even. And I think of how beautifully David begins and how tragically he ends. So, constant vigilance, right? I used to tell my children, maybe you've heard this statement that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. And I would add to that, the price of righteousness is eternal vigilance. David starts out great. A couple of things before we get into that. Of course, this is the first book of Samuel, chapter 17 and 18, 24 to 26, and a few chapters in 2 Samuel as well to conclude this week's readings. I do want to mention that, yes, I decided to start celebrating early for the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in the United States. And you probably had that Fifth Sunday presentation with the video that Elder Cook participated in, and that was supposed to be shown in all our wards. Some interesting comments from my children. We have a WhatsApp chain, and someone asked people to comment on how it went in their wards. And it was a mixed bag. Some of them said it was pretty innocuous in a way, but they were kind of disappointed that it wasn't a little more sometimes focused on the blessings of liberty and this country's part in the restoration. However, others were pretty happy with the way things went. Some were a little confused. And then there was a report from an extended family member's missionary son serving in the Northeast states of the United States. I'm not sure exactly where, and don't want to point that out, even if I did review, but said that there was kind of a big argument in their ward and in the Sunday school class, and that the teacher and some of the other ward members in that Fifth Sunday presentation walked out. So anyway, interesting times we're in, right? But I am not saying that any country is without flaws, certainly. But I would never deny what the Book of Mormon teaches about the United States, this land of America being a land of promise, certainly foreordained to be hidden from the so-called civilized world back in that earlier time, so that when it was established by settlers, that it could be different from the countries in the rest of the world, and that it could be a land of religious freedom, and again set the stage for the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. As we've said so many times, this is the only country where that could have happened. And that doesn't mean other countries aren't contributing in wonderful ways or have historically contributed. As you know, my mother came from France and my father from Mexico, and they loved their countries of origin, and they taught us to love their countries of origin. They also taught us to love this land, and they were very grateful for it. In fact, at my dad's funeral, I decided to display both the American flag and the Mexican flag on either side of his casket, and then the chapel got permission to display the flags and so on, and then had a very gifted florist that did such a beautiful job because we did the casket spray with red, white, and blue flowers that then changed partway into red, white, and green. Of course, red, white, and blue for the United States, and red, white, and green for the flag of Mexico. So it was actually quite stunning. And a lot of people noticed, which was kind of fun. And I just thought my dad would have really appreciated that because he loved his country of origin so much and was so grateful that he and my mom could serve as mission leaders there in Mexico after they retired. But he loved this country too. And so, anyway, it was kind of a fun legacy moment for the family. I mean, he lived a long life. It was not a tragic time. It was a time of reflection and gratitude for his amazing life. My mother as well, again, loved France. And I have a great love for both of those countries. I'm really grateful that we could visit in those wonderful places. Anyway, a couple of other things. I did want to give you a little advance notice. I've already announced this on Patreon, but I thought I would announce it here as well, that the first manuscript draft of the book on boundaries is finished. It was kind of a sprint to the finish line at the end of May, and I then recorded another episode for Follow Him and didn't have as much time as I would have liked to prepare for that. So hopefully it went well enough, but I did have kind of a big crash afterwards because it was a miracle, and I am really grateful. There are revisions to be done, and I have 2 daughters-in-laws, bless them, who have volunteered to read, and they have read that manuscript, and they're going through it again and making really great comments and, catching some errors and things like that. And I'm hoping to really focus on that now in the next few weeks and try to really get this moving along so that it will be available soon. And at the end of June, I think we're going to have pre-sales available on the lilyanderson.com website. It will still take probably a few months to have the copies ready to send out, but we are getting close, and it is really these last increases in my pyrite dose that have made this possible. I'm super grateful for the doctor I've been working with, super grateful for the blessings of the Lord that have allowed that. It's really a blessing that I am grateful for. And so far, my daughters-in-laws are telling me that it makes sense. Just need to go back and add some things and maybe revise a few things as well before it can go into editing. But again, just want to let you know that this long-awaited project is further than I would have imagined it could be, the way I have felt the last couple of years. Very grateful for that. I also am grateful for your patience. It's not even going to be that long a book, but it will make the point, and applications could go on forever. So I'm kind of deciding how many more examples to add, although there are many applications given in the book already. Okay. I wanted to share this comment from a YouTube podcast viewer, Robert. I do read all the comments. That wasn't the case a few years ago, but I am so grateful that I'm back to where I can do that. And I really appreciate all the comments. And I know that on the audio podcast, there's not really a place to comment, but I'm so appreciative for all of you listeners. And special thanks to my Patreon subscribers. You are the reason this continues. Robert wrote, because I had talked about false traditions, right? And how we had mentions of false traditions in our April conference. And I thought that was really interesting as the worldwide church expands into all kinds of places where there are traditions that do not line up with the gospel of Jesus Christ and need to be changed into more gospel culture. And they were really tender stories. Anyway, Robert added another comment on traditions from General Conference in April. He was quoting Elder Clark Gilbert, saying, "We eventually asked John why he had never joined the church. He cited the need to honor the faith traditions of his now deceased parents." So, great catch, Robert. This is another comment on letting go of traditions that have come from our legacy, our families, our countries, whatever. We helped him realize that they now understood the church and they would honor his decision, referring to the fact that in the spirit world, missionary work is happening. So people who are awaiting the time of the resurrection that have not had a chance to receive the gospel are receiving the gospel. And then Robert continues with this tender family story. The above quotation from Elder Gilbert explains why my deceased grandmother, who was raised in the Lutheran tradition, came to my mother in a dream and encouraged her to join the LDS church that the missionaries were telling her about. My mother was steeped in Lutheran tradition and was a teacher of its theology in the Lutheran school system. Wow, that's engagement, She was a faithful member of her Lutheran church and very involved in teaching theology in their school system. Her mother, he writes, now understood the church, which is a quote from Clark Gilbert, and could offer her endorsement. Isn't that a beautiful family story? That this family came into the church because a loving deceased mother came to his mother and told her, even though you have been in the tradition of our family a faithful Lutheran, it's time now to accept the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I think that's beautiful. Okay, some sadder stories now. A couple of current events. I haven't done those too much recently in the interest of saving some time, but I'm just going to make some quick mentions here. Tragically, a British university student was stabbed by an immigrant from India in Great Britain. Now, this happened, I think, last December, but the trial was in May, and I think the sentencing in June. So it's current news again, and apparently Vice President J.D. Vance posted something where he was commenting on how quickly we can lose Western civilization if we don't protect it, and we start to sometimes even leave citizens and the culture of our countries vulnerable to other traditions that come in that can be in harsh contrast and even in conflict with Western traditions. So what happened was that he was apparently walking with some friends, and this immigrant from India stabbed him with a ceremonial knife that had an 8-inch blade. So it's a pretty large knife that typically would have been against the law in Great Britain to carry. But because it had to do with his country of origin and his religious traditions, it was exempted from the prevailing law that was a long-standing law that you can't carry a weapon like that on the streets. And he used that weapon to kill this university student. Now, he stabbed him several times. The student didn't die immediately, but bobbies were called, the police were called, and when they came, the man from India said that the student had thrown a racial slur at him. So the policeman handcuffed the student. They even had video. I saw a brief video. It was not super clear, and I'm glad for that. They even, kind of X'd out some parts. But the student was asking for help and saying he had been stabbed, and they kind of expressed disbelief. So they're handcuffing him because of the accusation that he spoke a racial slur at the immigrant, and the immigrant is the one who accused him of that, and the bobbies believed him and apparently did not notice. I mean, maybe his clothing was dark and, there wasn't good light, so they didn't notice that he had been stabbed in the chest. And while he was detained, he died and just, bled out from the wounds. So anyway, Vice President Vance was saying, we can't bend over backwards to take an accusation of a racial slur and use that to then not even give sort of equal time to the native citizen of the UK, who it turns out never issued a racial slur. And that came out in the trial, and the man from India has been convicted of murder. But can you see the concern there? And this is what I've mentioned before. The term comes from a Canadian psychologist who apparently is relocating to the United States. His name is Gad Saad. Very bright man, I think originally from Lebanon, and he has written a book that was released just a couple weeks ago called Suicidal Empathy. I actually have it on Kindle. I've just barely started. I think I got through the foreword. So it may take me forever to read it at this pace, especially because I'm trying to get these other projects going. But I have appreciated listening to him talk on this subject for at least a year or more. And this is one of the examples of suicidal empathy. Or, as I would say, charity run amok. I mean, charity misunderstood and misapplied, which I actually talk about quite a bit in the Boundaries book. That is one of the major points, is that we, with good intention, often mischaracterize and misapply charity, and it ends up enabling the wrong things. So just wanted to mention that here we have another example of this and how it can be really problematic for civilization. So another tragic story that I mentioned when it happened, but is now coming to trial as well, is the case of then 17-year-old Black man, Carmelo Anthony, who stabbed and killed a white 17-year-old Austin Metcalf at a Texas high school track meet. And you probably remember some of the reports at the time, but it's in the news again because, as with the other case, it has gone to trial now. They were doing jury selection, and they had a really difficult time finding jurors that passed the test of both attorneys. And it ended up being an all-white jury, which immediately has sparked some protests from certain elements in our society, certain political parts, and also Black community groups sometimes. Not all Black people feel this way, but some have been very vocal about the fact that this is a racial setup and he's just going to be a sacrifice on the altar of racism, so to speak. Now, I certainly hope that's not the case, and I don't suspect that it is automatically, but it just shows how tribal we are becoming, how this was really not the case. I'm not saying that racism isn't an ongoing concern in every country. The United States honestly has a history of less racism than most countries. Now, certainly the Deep South, we know that, there have been issues there, not for every person that was in the Deep South, but some of the institutions and so on were much slower to get past slavery, to get past segregation and things like that. So that's certainly historical. But the rest of the country, and many people in the South as well, were eager to see those things change and have not been terribly oriented toward discrimination. And I think, you see that as we've had immigration from all over the world. And, there are always people who are maybe suspicious of those who are different. But generally speaking, there was a lot of that melting pot idea that happened here, which was great, blending of people into America. I've said before, this is my one big complaint about my parents. I mean, I can get by in Spanish decently. I have some gaps in my vocabulary, there's no question, but I can get by. But I had to work on it myself. And my French used to be better than Spanish, but, now it's worse. I wish I had time to, enjoy those languages better. But my parents would not speak them at home because they wanted us to be American. So that was the attitude a lot of times of immigrants. Again, it didn't mean that they all removed their languages from the home, but that was the attitude. It was like, we're here now, we want to be American, and we want our children to be American. And anyway, we're seeing more tribalism than that these days, which is so sad because there were some interviews there. People were doing man on the street interviews outside the courthouse. And there were, again, not everybody who's an African American feels like this, but there were some who were saying, I would never convict a brother and have him go to prison. Like, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if he's guilty, because they were like, well, what if the evidence shows or whatever? And they were like, no, I just wouldn't send another brother to prison. And so it's like, justice doesn't matter. It's all about which tribe we're in, right? And that can be a political party. That could be an ethnic group. It can be a race, which is really so opposite of what God says, who makes it clear that he is no respecter of persons. That all are his children. He expects us to treat each other as brothers and sisters, which doesn't mean we develop suicidal empathy and mischaracterization and misapplication of charity in order to try to accommodate people whose backgrounds or traditions may not be consistent with Western countries. Anyway, interesting to see all that. There were some really tragic statements that were being made, again, both men and women who were interviewed who were like, it doesn't matter if he's guilty or not. He needs to be released and not sent to prison. And, it's sad. It's sad that we have let go of light in a way that, again, I'm not saying these are all terrible people. I'm just saying that is a limiting view, as if truth doesn't matter, as if murdering another kid at a track meet doesn't require some kind of legal response to protect all our communities from accepting violence as sort of par for the course. So God is not wanting us to identify that way. And again, I've referred to this so many times, but it was so beautiful and inspired when President Nelson said, child of the covenant and disciple of Christ, that those should be our identity. Nothing else should interfere with that. On the other side of things, and this was lovely, there was a Harvard graduation speaker. I didn't catch his name. I'm sure I could have looked it up, and I didn't. But he spoke, and a lot of people stood at the end and gave him, an ovation. It was really quite lovely, and it was just at the beginning of June that I saw part of the speech in a video. He began by introducing himself as a proud Jew. And then he said he had a grandfather who was a Muslim, a grandmother who was a Christian, and another grandfather who was a Jew. And he talked about how well their family got along, how they didn't agree, but they respected each other and they talked to each other and they listened to each other. And they were always cordial. And yes, they might have discussions where they were talking about things that they would never see the same way, but they were kind and respectful of the family members and got along. And he mentioned that when he would speak to any one of them, they would always sort of ask about the others. Oh, how's your other grandfather doing? Or how's your other, And so it was really a very lovely speech. What happened apparently is that this Muslim grandfather married a Christian. And then they had a daughter who married a Jew and converted to Judaism. And those were his parents. So, and then he said, my grandfather, forgive me if my details are off, but I think he said he was buried with his feet pointing toward Mecca in the Muslim tradition. And his grandmother was buried with a cross. And then his Jewish grandfather was buried in the Jewish tradition. There's a ritual involved with funerals in Judaism. So he had gone that route in his religion. So anyway, it was really a very lovely speech, or the part that I heard, and I thought it was a lovely invitation to people to listen. He didn't say we couldn't defend our views. He actually said we should defend our views. We just don't have to be hostile, which is the anti-tribalism message. So that was lovely. David and Goliath, what a great story. I'm not going to repeat a lot of the details that are so familiar, right? But I will say that it is very clear that David's frame of reference is God. And we talked about God being our reference group. And David is really a good example of that in his beginnings. He acknowledges and cares for God. Notice that when the story is told about the Philistines coming against Israel and Goliath of Gath, who was probably a 9-foot-something guy who is defying the armies of Israel and wants one-on-one combat, that of course nobody is stupid enough to come forth to volunteer for that, and if Goliath wins, which looks like a shoo-in, is going to then make the citizens of Israel slaves of the Philistines. So he defies the armies of Israel this day, and it talks about the armies of Israel throughout chapter 17 here. But then when David comes to see his brothers and so on, he immediately refers to the armies not as the armies of Israel, but as the armies of the living God. This is chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel 17, the end of verse 26. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? according to the record, David is the only one who makes that connection, who has as his reference that Israel has the true God, Jehovah, to worship, and that Jehovah uses the armies of Israel in whatever appointed way to deliver Israel because they are God's people. And so he immediately shows that that is his framework. And that phrase is used throughout this story as he volunteers to go fight. And then again in verse 36, we're still in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel, verse 36, partway through. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Of course, they try to give him Saul's armor and whatever, and he's too young to carry any of that, and he's just like, no. And he goes and takes 5 smooth stones, and then, of course, Goliath is insulted by young David. Am I a dog? This is verse 43. Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Come to me and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air. That's verse 44. Verse 45 then said, and this is of course something that, the language is so beautiful, and to think of this young man saying these words with such confidence and courage. Now, we know that fear could have been involved because courage is overcoming fear. So, looking at the facts here, or the most probable outcome, there's great courage here. But I love this in verse 45. You know these words. Then said David to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel. It's so beautiful that he knows exactly on whose behalf he fights and who will fight with him. Verse 46, that this day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee. Verse 47, again, this boy has been taught the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he believes. Verse 47, and all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. In other words, this isn't a contest of strength. Look at the history of Israel. Like, why do these people struggle to remember this, right? But you have Moses, okay, with the support of Aaron, but it's Moses standing against the power of Pharaoh. And God gets his people out of Egypt. And then Joshua, not even raising a sword, to have the walls of Jericho crumble to the ground before they go in. And then Gideon with his 300. There were so many examples, of course, against the Amalekites and so many others where God gave them the victory. And it didn't have to do with any kind of math equation. It had to do with, like, the Lord fights for us if we are his people. Now, it's always according to his timing, as we know, and according to our righteousness. But this is what he promised the Nephites as well. And he delivered with the Nephites. If they were righteous, he would protect them, and they could prevail even against the terrifying rage and brutality of the Lamanites. It wasn't about a sword. It wasn't about weapons. The Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's. All right, so I was talking with a friend of mine, and we were discussing some situations where, the Lord works in mysterious ways, we say, right? In other words, it seems like we walk a maze. Sometimes it's even like a labyrinth, very, very circuitous in the ways that our lives go when we are hoping for certain outcomes and we pray for them diligently and we do what we can to do it. And, doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen. And then, who knows when? It could be years later, or, some of it will be in the spirit world or during the millennium that the Lord will fulfill the promises. And when they come, it's like, wow, what it took to get here, and that the Lord did it in the Lord's way and in the Lord's time. Like, let's say we have a wayward child and we are reaching out in the right ways, not trying to plague them, try to maintain the relationship, but hoping that we can influence, or, even if they're still young and getting into trouble in certain ways, we pray, we work, we try to do the right things as parents, and then as the parents of adult children or other family members or whomever, and then it has nothing to do with our efforts sometimes, and maybe somebody else shows up in their life or something happens that brings them back. My point is that it seems like crooked paths, but they're not crooked paths because the Lord saves. The Lord always saves. That's his business, to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. So it reminded me of this verse in Alma that I made an attempt to memorize once, but I didn't get super far, but it's pretty familiar to me at this point. Alma 7, verse 20. I perceive that it has been made known unto you by the testimony of his word. Here's the part that I love. That he cannot walk. This is talking about our Savior and Redeemer, Jesus Christ. He cannot walk in crooked paths. Neither doth he vary from that which he has said. Neither hath he a shadow of turning from the right to the left, or from that which is right to that which is wrong. Therefore his course is one eternal round. Now, that's not a flashy verse necessarily, but it really hit me years ago. And that was the part that I wanted to remember. He cannot walk in crooked paths. Neither doth he vary from that which he hath said. So, when we are feeling that we're caught in a maze, when we are wondering how on earth God can rescue this situation, how can he fulfill his promises, may we remember, like young David, the battle is the Lord's. Yes, we are to do what we can and not try to control that which we cannot control. And there's much we can control, brothers and sisters. Really, the only thing that I'm aware of that we can control is our own choices. And that is hard enough. That is challenging. But that's all we can control. And yes, choosing our own behaviors in our relationships with others is part of that, of course. Trying to be kind, trying to be honest, trying to be truly charitable, not suicidally empathetic, but truly charitable, trying to understand things as they really are. And yes, above all, well, it's all connected, being obedient to the commandments, but seeking to be guided by the Spirit. So again, quoting President Nelson, who has been quoted many times since he said this by other general authorities and lots of the rest of us, that we will not spiritually survive in the last days without the revelation of the Spirit, the Holy Ghost, really that sanctifying power, that receiving of revelation and inspiration as needed, and then acting on that. That is what we can work on and control. And it's hard enough, right? And then trust that the battle is the Lord's. And that God doesn't deviate from that which he has said. He doesn't walk in crooked paths. He is all about immortality, which is already accomplished, but giving people an opportunity for eternal life or salvation to whatever level of glory they desire. And we all end up happy with more than we deserve. So it's really an amazing plan. And I think it's what David knew at this time of his life. I don't think he ever forgot it really, but he sure has a tragic chapter in his life. And so, beautiful story here of how David, of course, defeats Goliath. He's heralded by everybody. Saul has to, celebrate him as well. But Saul very quickly becomes jealous because, can you imagine this young kid? And by the way, if you haven't seen it recently or ever seen it, look up the picture of Michelangelo's sculpture of David that is in a beautiful place in Florence, Italy. You don't have to travel there to see it, but there are beautiful, beautiful pictures, probably even videos of that incredible sculpture. It is really stunning. And it does kind of fill you with this tenderness to think of this young man who was so full of faith. He becomes, a brother to Saul's son, Jonathan. Jonathan is Saul's oldest son. And It's a beautiful statement here in the beginning of chapter 18, first verse. The soul of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And they make a covenant together that they will be brothers, basically. And it says several times in the record here that David, this is verse 5, but I'm not sure it's even the first time it says it, that David behaved himself wisely. So he's not apparently succumbing to the popularity that came instantly with his victory over Goliath, but he's behaving himself in wise ways. But nevertheless, in verse 7, chapter 18, verse 7, the people start saying, Saul hath slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. And immediately in verse 8, Saul was very wroth. He's really angry that David is more popular than he is, and that they are more impressed with David's military abilities. And he says at the end of verse 8, what can he have more but the kingdom? In other words, he's already gained all his popularity and strength, and everybody knows him, so he must be desiring the kingdom. Now, it is clear that David does not desire to take the kingdom from Saul, and he refers to Saul again and again in this record as the Lord's anointed, because Samuel had anointed Saul to be king, and David respects that. Now, he has been anointed. Probably they estimate he was around 15 years old when Samuel anointed David to be king. And he's probably not a lot older than that when he comes to Saul's palace, because the armies of Israel service began at age 20. So, according to Bible scholars. So, he wasn't eligible for the army yet, but an older teenager perhaps. And then this amazing thing happens with his trusting that the Lord will give him the victory over Goliath, which happens. And then he's super popular, becomes super close to Jonathan. And shortly after that, the daughter of Saul falls in love with David. Now, this is interesting to me. I don't know if I ever put it together before, but again, verse 16 of chapter 18, all Israel and Judah loved David. Notice they're dividing Israel from Judah. Israel, the northern 10 tribes, and Judah and Benjamin in the south. But both parts of the kingdom love David. But Saul, in chapter 18, verse 17, wants to make a political marriage here and marry David to the elder daughter, Merab, but he's trying to set him up, because at the end of that verse it says, Saul said, let not mine hand be upon him, but let the hand of the Philistines be upon him. Does that ring a bell anywhere? Again, in verse 25 at the end, Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. What happens next week? When David gets Bathsheba pregnant, he puts Uriah in the battle, so that at the forefront, the front lines, so that David's hand won't kill Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, but that the enemy armies will do it for him. That's exactly what Saul's doing. So, how much did David know of that? Did it lodge in some brain cell somewhere? Because Saul was planning the same thing that David eventually executes in his premeditated murder of Uriah. Tragic. But at any rate, Michal falls in love with David, and Saul says, okay. And he says, go get me 100 foreskins of the Philistines. So kill at least 100. And he thinks the Philistines will kill David, because that's a pretty big task. But David, I think, even doubles that number. And then in verse 29, Saul was yet the more afraid of David, and Saul became David's enemy continually. Okay, I'm not going to go through the details of this. I hope that you will read the chapters designated and even maybe touch base with the ones in between, or at least read the headings, because there's some interesting things going on. But the basic arc of this story is that for the next 7-ish years, Saul tries to kill David. And he is saved sometimes by Jonathan and sometimes by his wife, Michal. And, there are people who are sympathetic to David and some who are sympathetic to Saul. So he's kind of a fugitive for this time. Now, he's been anointed to be king. He saved the armies of Israel through the strength of God against the giant Goliath. And now he's hunted. He does have some very loyal fighting men that stay with him. He develops this kind of contingent of fighting men that are very, very skilled and loyal to him. Sometimes he gets help, sometimes he doesn't. There's the story of Abigail and her husband. The husband doesn't want to help, but then Abigail goes and helps him. At any rate, he is separated from his wife. And eventually Saul gives Michal to another man to be this other man's wife, which, as we see, becomes a real sore spot for David, who does marry other women in sort of political situations, but he still is hurt by that and maybe pretty offended as well. Anyway, he is continually faithful to Saul. He has a couple of opportunities that are recorded in this book of 1 Samuel to kill Saul. And he is like close enough to take part of his robe or to take his water bottle or whatever, and in the night, and he doesn't kill Saul, but then displays them the next day. And Saul, for a moment, usually says, "Oh, you're a better man than I am. I'm sorry," and whatever. But it's never safe enough for David to return to anything close to Saul. So he does remain this kind of strong fugitive until, in a battle with the Philistines, the Philistines prevail, and Saul has 3 sons that are killed in the battle, Jonathan being one of them. And then he manages to escape with his armor bearer, but when he sees the devastating loss and the death of those 3 sons, according to Bible scholars, Saul had 7 sons and 3 daughters, but he lost 3 of them in that battle, and he tells the armor bearer to kill him, and the armor bearer is afraid of doing that, so he falls on his sword, and Saul suicides. That's the end of his life. The armor bearer follows suit and is also then killed by suicide. They are found by the Philistines, the bodies, and they take off his head, display it, and they hang the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons that perished in that battle on the walls. That was an act of, again, brutality and incredible flagrant disrespect, right, of the enemy. And the Jebusites, at the end of 1 Samuel, I think it's the Jebusites, who see that dishonoring of Saul and his sons, and in the night they go and take the bodies and bury them so that they're no longer on display. So what else happens that I want to talk about here? Again, broadly, because this is pretty familiar stuff, and I do hope that you'll read it to remind yourself of some of the details that are included in this week's study. Judah, after Saul's death, anoints David to be king. Now, again, this is not a formal division of the kingdom, but it's kind of a precursor to what is coming after the reign of Solomon is over, where there is a permanent split between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. This happens in a similar way that is not very long enduring, but it shows that there were tensions and divisions between those 2 groups, the 10 tribes in the north and Judah and Benjamin in the south, but they usually just say Judah. The tribe of Benjamin is very small because there was a kind of a second civil war in Israel, and the Benjamites were involved in sodomy, and so they're largely wiped out. There are just very few men remaining, so they almost just don't mention them anymore. But when they say Judah, remember that there's some Benjamin in there, and of course some Levi is also there because the Levites do the ordinances for the sacrifices. The southern group, Judah, anoints David to be king. In the north, one of Saul's sons, named Ishbosheth, is anointed king. And he's kind of a puppet king because the power is really with Abner. Now, Abner was one of Saul's commanders. In fact, one of the times when David entered in the cave where Saul was asleep and he takes some of his belongings to show the next day, he kind of taunts Abner. David taunts Abner and says, "You didn't do your job," because Abner is like commander of the armies, and he says, "You left your king so unprotected that I could walk right in and take some of his personal stuff." So Abner and David have already had some interaction that's intense, and then Abner supports Saul's son. Abner also is a cousin of Saul, so there's a big family connection here, and he's kind of the kingmaker for Ishbosheth, who's not a very strong figure, but Abner makes him so and keeps the military in control, supporting that king. So now we have a division, as I said, that lasts about 7 years again, and it starts to fall apart when Ishbosheth accuses Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines, one of his father's concubines. Now, this was a typical play for power in these times, that if somebody wanted to be king or seize the control of the kingdom, they would sleep with the previous monarch's wife or concubine. And it's never clear whether that happened or not exactly, but Ishbosheth thinks that it did, and he accuses Abner of this, and Abner gets pretty upset and defects to David and goes to David and says, I can bring the northern kingdom under your jurisdiction. Because he really is the power in the north. And this is where it's kind of interesting and tender, because David says, I'm not going to accept this offer unless you give me back my wife, Michal. Now, for years, Michal has been with another man, apparently loves him, and he loves her. But David also makes the same demand of Ishbosheth. So they send Michal back to David. And her husband is really upset and follows, mourning and grieving. And it doesn't seem like David and Michal are ever reconciled. And then toward the end of our reading in 2 Samuel here, when David, who now is king of all of Israel, because it does work out that David becomes anointed by also the northern tribes as king, that he then establishes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which is new, and it is called the City of David. And he brings the Ark of the Covenant there. And when the Ark comes, he is so full of joy, he dances, and we don't have the details, but Michal thinks he's lowering himself and embarrassing himself, and it says she despises him for it. And then, she ends up dying without a child because they never really get back together, which is really kind of a sad story because they were quite in love early on. And I'm going to comment on what happens with monarchies here in a moment, but there's more drama because Abner, in one of the battles with David's southern armies, the armies of Judah, when he is fighting for Ishbosheth in the north, he doesn't want to, but he is being quickly or closely followed by one of the brothers of Joab. And Joab is David's military commander, also one of David's nephews. So Joab's brother, who would be also a nephew of David's, is killed by Abner, who tries to get away from him but can't, and so he does turn and kill him. And Joab carries a grudge. So he, by deception, agrees to take Abner somewhere and then kills him in order to get revenge for his brother. And now David is concerned that the northern kingdom that are loyal to Abner will think that David did it. So David makes a public statement and demands that Joab put on sackcloth and ashes and show all kinds of sorrow. And he even curses the posterity of Joab and, makes a big statement in following the funeral procession of Abner that he is sorry for the loss of this man and all of this. So he doesn't want to strain those newly formed joinings of the northern tribes to David's reign. And so it does work out. He actually asks Solomon, his son, on David's deathbed, basically asks Solomon to kill Joab. So he doesn't forget this real risk to the reunification of the kingdom, of the tribes. But he doesn't kill him in his own reign because it is suggested that Joab had quite a following and was a popular military commander. And David had been dependent on that. And again, he's just trying to hold the kingdom together and not rock the boat too much. So politics are politics, right? And they've always been so. And they can get pretty ugly. And justice isn't always the main consideration. So David's life is, as I said, tragic. Tragic in so many ways, triumphant in some ways. And we usually consider that Saul was the beginning of the golden age of Israel. But Saul is kind of a tragic figure very quickly because of his pride. And then he tries to spend so much time trying to kill David. But Saul, David, and Solomon are considered the golden age of Israel. Solomon really brings in this period of incredible wealth, builds the temple, builds a huge palace. We'll talk about all that. But previously, David is kind of a happy beginning of that prosperity because David still cares what the Lord thinks. And before he goes to battle, in some of his doings, he prays to the Lord and says, is this the right time to go? So his beginnings are really good. They're really good. And it is beautiful to see that he had the capacity to be a great leader in Israel and was for a period of time. But interestingly, again, you're probably anointed by Samuel when he's 15-ish, then becomes king of Judah, the southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, at 30, after being on the run for 7-ish years. And then it takes another 7 years before he's king of the united Israel at about age 37, the record says. So it's a long time for the fulfillment of that anointing. Now, some of us wait longer than that. What is that, about 22 years? Some of us wait longer for the fulfillment of a blessing or an anointing or a patriarchal blessing. But as much as we may get caught in the maze of life and feel like we're in the labyrinth, God does not walk in crooked paths. Everything is to help to bring to pass, again, immortality is taken care of, but the eternal life of man, at whatever level, eternal life being with God, but at whatever level we are willing to receive the glory to come. And God is not deviating from that. We walk the maze sometimes, but God's walk is straight, and the promises are fulfilled, and the battle is the Lord's, and the victory is the Lord's. Well, I did want to mention a couple of other things. Jerusalem, of course, is on the site of what had been Salem, which was governed by Melchizedek, and it also became, like the city of Enoch, righteous enough to be translated. So now it's Jerusalem, but it was Salem. And it also is considered the spot where Mount Moriah was, and Abraham offered Isaac, or was about to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. And of course, some of those places are like, there's a rock in the Dome of the Rock Mosque, which is at Al-Aqsa Mosque. I mean, it's really an amazing building that is built on the site of the ancient site of Solomon's temple. And they have this rock that they have sort of a footprint looking thing in it. And Islamic tradition says that it was the site of the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And also there's a footprint there that is supposed to show Muhammad ascending to heaven from that spot. So it's like this really sacred spot in Islam. It's a sacred spot in Judaism because Solomon's temple needs to be rebuilt there. And it's a sacred spot for Christians because Abraham is our father. And we also believe in the inspired work of building Solomon's temple, and that will be important to rebuild. It'll be destroyed again in the abomination of desolation after the two prophets are killed in Jerusalem, but then it will be rebuilt and be one of the capitals from which the Lord reigns. Now, what I wanted to say, about kings is just like, this was a good reminder to me because, not that you really forget, but monarchy is really a problem. And yet, if it's a righteous monarchy, it's great because you don't have to go through legislatures who, as we know, can screw everything up and become incredibly corrupt. So if you have a prophet king, that is as close as we can come on the earth to a theocracy, right? And that is celestial government. But as explained in Mosiah chapter 29, there's a real risk with that, because if the form of monarchy continues with an unrighteous king, all of a sudden you're not in a terrestrial government, you're in a telestial government. I talk a lot about this in my book, Choosing Glory, that the telestial counterfeits the celestial. So God creates this celestial form, and then Satan counterfeits it. And it can look very similar, but the content is diametrically different. Instead of being righteous, it's wicked. So you can see how one person at the top would be the case with the monarchy. And if it's a righteous king, like King Mosiah the first, King Benjamin, his son, King Mosiah the second, but those three prophet kings in a row, righteous men who are working with prophets and being inspired and doing God's will and leading the people in righteous ways, that the people are incredibly blessed and more inclined to righteousness. But then you get King Noah for the group that goes back to the land of Nephi, right? And sets up shop down there. And, Zeniff was okay as the leader and first king, and then his son Noah is terrible. And so the whole group goes into evil and eventually bondage and have to be delivered. So that's Mosiah's point. This is after everybody's back, and those people that were captive to the Lamanites for a while, and Alma and his group are all reunited in Zarahemla. And it turns out that King Mosiah has 4 sons who don't want to be king. Did I mention them? I'm not sure I mentioned them when I was talking about Harper's project. Harper has a sort of ongoing document that we talk about every once in a while about the men who would not be king. And Alma is one, and Nephi, and we've talked about some of the sons of Jared. Well, the sons of Mosiah are on that list as well, right? George Washington's on that list. But none of King Mosiah's sons want to be king. So Mosiah makes a really great speech about government. And I think it's really a great thing to understand and to recognize. Again, Satan's counterfeits are so destructive, but they can be so deceptive because they have a similar form to righteousness. Think in terms of economy for a second. Again, the united order is God's economy. That's celestial. But the telestial is socialism and communism. But the form is so similar that there were a lot of people after World War II who thought that the USSR was actually doing the law of consecration because they went into this, deep communist era. So it can be deceptive. People think like, oh, look, they're sharing everything. No, it's not voluntary. There's no private ownership. It's all, anyway, state-owned, and it's a dictatorship, really. I mean, one guy at the top, though, who gets wealthy and everybody else is poor, right? Anyway, okay, let's read what Mosiah says here. First, he says, look, if we appoint somebody else that's not my son, and then one of his sons wants to be a king, he's going to draw away some of the people after him, and there'll be wars and contentions and shedding of much blood. Does that remind us of what we just have been reading in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel? When there's contention about who's going to be the king. And of course, monarchies typically go with primogeniture, right? Which is the first son, or sometimes first daughter too, but that's less common. Historically, it was typically the first son that would be the next king. So if somebody else wants to be king, there's bloodshed. And that's exactly what happened. David was anointed to be king because Samuel told Saul that he and his house would be removed from God's protection as monarchs. So even though Jonathan is a good guy, Saul's house is not going to rule anymore. But because people want that to happen, guess what? The whole 10 tribes follow Abner's support of one of Saul's sons. And it takes 7 years of war with Judah in order for, there's some, intrigue in the northern kingdom between Abner and Ishbosheth. And then he defects to David, but they're still struggling. Oh, by the way, the son of Saul is killed by a couple of his own military guys who are brothers because he's very weak after Abner leaves and is not impressing anybody, so he's assassinated. So we see exactly what Mosiah is talking about here, that monarchies are tough, and that vying for complete power can lead to wars and bloodshed when there are different factions who believe different people should be king, even if it's like a first son or a second son or a third son. And we see that with the Jaredites, remember? Lots of contention about who was going to be the next king. And some of them are imprisoning their own sons or imprisoning their own fathers, or, a brother kills a brother. Anyway, it's a mess. It's a mess because power is so easily corrupting when people are focused on the power. Now, again, you got to give David credit. He's not in a hurry to be king. And he says again and again, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. He supports Saul's monarchy. He doesn't try to end it early. He could have. And Saul is hunting him to kill him. But he's like, no, I'm not grasping for this power. So Saul is safe from me, even though David is not safe from Saul. Anyway, going on here, this is Mosiah chapter 29 in the Book of Mormon, of course. He says, let us be wise. And then in verse 11, let us appoint judges. And we will appoint wise men to be judges. Verse 12, it is better that a man should be judged of God than of man. But, he says in verse 13, if it were possible that you could have just men to be your kings, who would establish the laws of God, judge his people according to his commandments, etc., if you could have a king like my father Benjamin, I say unto you, if this could always be the case, it would be expedient that ye should always have kings to rule over you. I remember that surprised me when I was a young kid reading the Book of Mormon, because probably in high school when I noticed this, and I was like, wow, I didn't think it was good to have kings. God's saying, well, if you could guarantee that they would be just kings, it would be great. But you can't. That's the whole point. You can't. Here's the form, but the content can easily be disrupted by the next group or somebody else who wants the power and goes to war. Okay, and then he says, jumping to verse 16, now I say unto you that because all men are not just, it is not expedient that you should have a king or kings to rule over you. For behold, how much iniquity doth one wicked king cause to be committed? And he talks about King Noah, who really brings those people into bondage and all kinds of evil. And then he says, verse 21, you cannot dethrone an iniquitous king, save it be through much contention and the shedding of much blood. Again, it's going to lead to war, and war is always hell. So, verse 24, it is not expedient that such abomination should come. Verse 25, therefore choose you by the voice of the people judges. That's a representative system. Now, this is not a celestial system. It's a terrestrial system. And as I explain in Choosing Glory, it is a safety net. The terrestrial systems and institutions are a safety net against the telestial. They're not perfect. They're not ideal. The ideal would be a theocracy, or the earthly version of that would be a prophet king. But you can't guarantee that the kings will follow God. So a safety net is a representative system where people vote and the majority elects, we hope the majority elects, if we count our votes right, someone to represent them. Verse 26, and this has such resonance today, doesn't it? Now, it is not common that the voice of the people desireth anything contrary to that which is right. Now, even when I really first zoned in on this or focused in on these verses, probably as a young adult, I think I was after I was married, but early, I remember talking to Chris about it. I said, that's quite a statement. It's not common that the voice of the people will choose that which is contrary to that which is right. But that used to be the case. And you can look historically back in representative governments, the people did typically elect decent leaders. Decent, nobody's perfect, right? But people who were pretty decent. But it is common for the lesser part of the people to desire that which is not right. Therefore, this shall ye observe and make it your law to do your business by the voice of the people. So in other words, we're kind of depending on the fact that it's usually the case that the majority of people want that which is right. That's what God is saying through Mosiah. Verse 27, and again, this is very relevant to our day. If the time comes that the voice of the people doth choose iniquity, or people to represent them that are not right, then is the time that the judgments of God will come upon you. So, sobering words that we are living. Yea, then is the time he will visit you with great destruction, even as he hath hitherto visited this land. So I think it's marvelous to see how inspired these prophets have been and how much they have tried to teach us about the ways of the Lord. Righteous kings would be preferable, but since we can't guarantee the content of that form, we go with a terrestrial safety net, which is a representative form of government. And then we protect ourselves to an extent until things ripen in iniquity, but we protect ourselves from the telestial form, which is one guy at the top who is evil. And of course, any dictator or, Mao, Stalin, Hitler, Genghis Khan. And I know a lot of people would look at our modern day people, and I'm not saying that we're talking about great choices. I've often said, and honestly, for decades now, that sometimes, and maybe all the time now, it's like, should I vote for Getty Enton number 1 or Getty Enton number 2? Now, I still think some policies can be preferable to others. Doesn't mean that the leader is representative of my values or has lived a life that I would find good, but I can still support some policies over others. And yeah, maybe we are choosing Getty Enton 1 or Getty Enton 2, or at least something close to that. Again, I'm not saying there aren't some decent people who may still be trying to do what's right in government, but it's hard to know, right? And sometimes the way things don't get passed that should get passed, I mean, it's just sort of astonishing. But we do see the voice of the people making some really, really interesting choices now in local government elections as well. The New York legislature apparently is proposing something. It hasn't passed yet. Did it pass one of the houses? I forget. But that is going to remove the words mother and father and replace them with like gestating person and non-gestating person. And it's like, you guys don't have bigger fish to fry with what's going on in your state. Like, you're bankrupt and you're in crazy debt and all these businesses are leaving and, your services are floundering and your education, your kids, so many of them can't read or do basic math, but you're going to make sure that we don't use the terms mother and father. Like, again, does that sound like Mosiah chapter 29 to you? It does to me. So anyway, I was really reminded of that because I look at this, struggle for power. And David wasn't in a hurry to take over from Saul, but Saul was so paranoid about David's popularity that he becomes a pretty dark person. And yes, it mentions again in one of these chapters that it was an evil spirit from the Lord. And of course, check the footnote because the JST corrects that. Joseph Smith rewrote that correctly under inspiration, revelation, to say the evil spirit was not of the Lord, because the Lord really doesn't walk in crooked paths, ever. Ever. His ways are straight, and he is all about fulfilling his promises if we will follow him, and we will be diligent in our efforts, imperfect though they may be. I just wanted to share that since I was thinking about celestial forms of government, that of course the ultimate will be during the millennial time when in those 1,000 years Christ reigns personally upon the earth. Now, we don't have a lot written about that I'm aware of, but I did want to share this statement by John Taylor. The Lord will be king over all the earth and all mankind literally under his sovereignty. So that will be the ultimate celestial form, right? A monarchy with God as the monarch. And every nation under the heavens will have to acknowledge his authority. So there will be nations, I guess, but anyway, I don't know how it works exactly. Like I said, we don't have it all spelled out, but this is a lovely image to me. Every nation under the heavens will have to acknowledge his authority and bow to his scepter. Those who serve him in righteousness will have communications with God and with Jesus, will have the ministering of angels, and will know the past, the present, and the future. and other people who may not yield full obedience to his laws, nor be fully instructed in his covenants, because not everybody will be a member at the beginning of the millennium, right? Maybe not even all the way through, because you just have to not be telestial. You can't be hurtful or destructive of others or hurtful or destructive of yourself. When we are no longer in the grip of the natural man, we are in a more terrestrial zone. We may not be celestial. We may not choose to hunger and thirst after righteousness, but we will qualify for being in the millennium. It will be the telestial who are destroyed at his coming and burn as stubble in the street. So the terrestrial will make it into the millennium, but they may not all be, of course, members of the church, but they're decent people. And there will be missionary work that will go on and invitations galore, but it will be interesting to see, because it's not the celestial kingdom yet. It's terrestrial, which is great, but it's not finished in its completion, which will happen, of course, at the end of the millennium and the final victory and final distribution into the three kingdoms of God. So, going back to that, other people who may not yet yield full obedience to his laws, nor be fully instructed in his covenants, will nevertheless have to yield full obedience to his government. That is going to be fascinating, for it will be the reign of God upon the earth, and he will enforce his laws, and which is going to require power. So, it's not power is bad, it's the wielding of power that can get dicey in a hurry. And he will enforce his laws and command that obedience from the nations of the world, which is legitimately his right. I think that's a beautiful statement. I hope it makes us excited for the coming of the Lord in an additional way. I think many of us very, very excited at the prospect of his coming. And we just have to control what we can control, which is our own natural man, and determined to be diligent in our efforts to receive his sanctifying Spirit, the Holy Ghost, to prepare us to walk and talk in his presence, to build Zion when the time is appointed. Brothers and sisters, we can do it. We can choose glory. We can build Zion. As ever, my profound gratitude for my wonderful husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.